A couple of years ago, I remember listening to a radio show and hearing a man being interviewed. And I could relate to part of his story, so I stayed tuned. He was an Air Force pilot. He flew F-4 Phantom jets. And when I say that word, I can hear the sound they make as the afterburners go on when they're taking off, because I lived that life. I lived on the flight line for a number of years in the Air Force. And one of the planes that we flew from our base every single day, probably not every day, but nearly every day, was Phantoms. We had a Phantom squadron. And why was this story interesting? Not only because of that shared history of aircrafts and aviation and the sound and power of those jets, but what was interesting to me was the man called in. He said he'd had a tragic car accident and had been paralyzed. And he said it was so ironic, of course, after the risks he took, meaning doing this daredevil work in aircraft, to finally be taken down by another car on the road. And here he was, he said, locked in a wheelchair, paralyzed and miserable. He said, I'm the miserable guy in the wheelchair. And he said, and everybody who knows me, who sees me, gets out of my way in my small town in wherever it was, USA. And he said, then I decided one day, I think prompted by something he'd heard this radio host say, to change my story. He said, I realized I couldn't get myself out of the wheelchair. I couldn't change that part of my life. But I actually could change the way I treated other people and the way I felt about my circumstances. And he said, I decided I don't have to be the miserable guy in the wheelchair. I have to be the guy in the wheelchair. I don't have to be the grumpy guy in the wheelchair coming at you at the supermarket. I could be the friendly guy in the wheelchair approaching you at the supermarket. And he thanked the host and he said, it really changed my life, this reframing. And I thought about that, and I've thought about that many times. All of us are in circumstances like the present ones, and we get to decide how we experience them. We also get to decide our affect. We get to decide how we affect other people. People in our homes, we get to decide how we affect them. That's a choice. And people in our surroundings, whenever it is, wherever it is that we go, we have impact on people. Are we approaching them with a smile under our mask, or are we approaching them with a scowl? Do we look approachable or unapproachable? Are we generous, which generally comes from a state of gratitude, or are we entitled, which comes from a state of entitlement? And entitlement is probably one of the most shockingly bad defects in human character, something that all of us can find ourselves prone to, but certainly something that all of us need to wheedle out of our character traits. So I offer you this story, that pilot and his story, because I think his circumstances are so bleak. And what an amazing thing that he decided one day, I don't need to be that. There are elements of my reality that I can't control, but there are elements of who I am and how I am that are under my control, and for that I take responsibility.